Andreas, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I applaud all of you for enduring a long day at PCR again. This is a fascinating topic. It's difficult to make interesting because there's so much clinical data to present. So I'm going to try to summarize for you and give you a sense as to the clinical evidence that's being displayed for this particular device, the Firehawk stent that you're very much familiar with, my potential conflicts of interest. So it begins with a very busy slide, which shows you the clinical trials roadmap of all the studies that were originally supported by the sponsor, including the initial beginning of Target FIM, first in man, Target 1, Target 2, the all-comer trial in Europe, and then many other studies that were related to either complex lesions or different pharmacotherapy regimens or specific country trials, so a total of 14 clinical trials. And then an additional 12 clinical trials that were investigator-initiated studies, again probing mechanistic insights, complex lesion subsets, all of which provides, I think, a very robust data set to look at. So I think we can say with a certain degree of confidence that the safety and efficacy of this Firehawk stent, which, as you know, is a thin strut cobalt alloy stent with abluminal grooves that have a bioresorbable polymer containing a low dose of sirolimus. So it has some of the most esoteric features of a drug-eluting stent. And we now have ongoing and proposed global clinical studies involving over 35,600 patients, probably as well studied a device in the coronary circulation as has been done by anyone, anywhere. So some of the results very quickly from the Target 1 randomized trial with 5-year follow-up compared to everolimus-eluting stents, showing no difference for all comparisons of clinical endpoints. Looking at safety endpoints, showing very low definite and probable stent thrombosis. Looking at a long lesion subset, again showing results that are at least as good as the comparison stent. So this novel Firehawk design has clearly demonstrated safety and efficacy from these 2 clinical trials that were done in China. So this now gets expanded to an all-comers trial chaired by William Wines that was in Europe, involving almost 1,700 patients. Again, a direct comparison of Firehawk versus the Xience everolimus-eluting stent, looking at the OCT sub-study here with 3-month outcomes, demonstrating all of the relevant OCT endpoints, neointimal thickness, covered stents, malapose struts, showing very similar outcomes between the new Firehawk versus the everolimus-eluting stent, and the powered QCA sub-study at 13 months, again showing very low late loss that was comparable to and certainly had a relevant p-value for non-inferiority compared to the everolimus-eluting stent, and 12-month clinical outcomes, again showing very good results that are at least the equivalent to what has been one of the predicate standards of drug-eluting stents, both at 12 months and now at 5 years follow-up. So these are very robust and interesting data, we believe. This leads to an exploration of more complex lesions. This is an interesting study. We generally don't see randomized trials in chronic total occlusions. This is chaired by Yaling Han, very well-known interventionalist in China, about 200 patients comparing Firehawk versus the Xience EES. Again, looking at a 12-month in-stent late lumen loss as the relevant primary endpoint, showing a late loss of about 0.21 in both groups, so clearly non-inferior. But interestingly, when you look at the clinical outcomes, it appeared that the Firehawk had lower clinical outcomes, at least in this small randomized trial, not really powered to show much in the way of clinical differences, but for many of the clinical endpoints did appear to be superior to EES in this complex lesion subgroup. There are additional data in STEMI, this OCT trial, in a small number of patients, showing in a STEMI population, again, that neointimal thickness at 6 months and the other relevant endpoints, covered struts and malapose struts, were very similar compared to the Xience EES. Now 3 pharmacotherapy trials, the first chaired by Jumbo Gu, large 2,500 patient trial looking at 3 versus 12-month DAPT in a near real-world like patient population. A second one, Target Safe, that looks at 1 versus 6-month DAPT in patients that are high bleeding risk. And then a third, the Target First trial that's chaired by Giuseppe Tarantini, looking at 1 versus 12-month DAPT in a very open-label randomized trial in AMI patients. So these are interesting pharmacotherapy studies, the results of which are still pending, but certainly will give us greater insights as to whether or not reduced DAPT therapy can be accompanied with the Firehawk in a variety of subsets. This takes us to the Target 4 North American trial. So we have been anxious to have an opportunity to work with this device in the United States. This is a single-blind non-inferiority trial in patients with at least 2 target vessels, a maximum of 2 target vessels, and up to 2 target lesions per vessel. There were certain restrictions on lesion length, had to be less than 34 millimeters. Vessel diameters were between 2.25 and 4 millimeters. And there were very few exclusion criteria, CTOs, vein grafts, and very recent STEMIs. We randomized 1,720 patients. There was both a QCA and an OCT subset, and about 100 sites from the US, Canada, Europe, and Japan. And this is now fully enrolled, including the subset trials as well, and is in follow-up. So a significant number of patients from Canada, 473 patients, 751 from the US, and 496 from our colleagues in Europe. So a total of over 1,700 patients. Last patient enrolled was November of 2022. And we're very excited to be able to see the endpoint of this important clinical trial that we hope will be able to present at TCT next year. So we are very excited to see what has been a global clinical trial blueprint with this very interesting and important drug-eluting stent that really spans the breadth of geographies, lesion complexity, pharmacotherapy alternatives, with a patient population of over 35,000 individuals. So certainly no paucity of data to look at, addressing now the full spectrum of disease complexity, which we think is important as you characterize a new drug-eluting stent. And would conclude that this novel Firehawk sirolimus-eluting stent, which features the thin strut design, abluminal grooves containing the biodegradable polymer and sirolimus, which gives you a very localized and targeted drug delivery, that there is very nicely demonstrated safety and efficacy in standard risk populations from Target 1 and 2. The safety and efficacy was comparable to Xience EES from real-world and complex populations in a variety of studies, including Target All-Comers, Target CTO, Target STEMI, variety of OCT trials. There will be an immense evidence database, including, as we said, a large number of patients from now 27 clinical trials that will address various safety and efficacy issues under various circumstances from the Target global clinical trials in the future. And we are anxiously awaiting and excited about the final results of the Target 4 North American trial, which we hope to present at TCT next year. Thank you.
Darren, I think you had a question.
So, Marty, with 27 trials, including 35,000 patients across FIM, type A lesions, all-comers, CTO, STEMI, OCT sub-studies, IVUS sub-studies, all geographies, maybe a question first regarding MicroPort. Where do they take this from here? Are they done? Are there new technological developments in terms of stent design coming? And then maybe a second question in relation to the DES era. Are we finished, and how do we continue to fund these large studies when the cost of stents and so forth is declining?
Those are two good questions. I'm going to take the second one first. I think we've gotten into a rut with clinical research, doing the same kinds of studies again and again and again. I think that we can learn from the past, and the degree to which we need these complex, multi-thousand patient randomized trials to qualify and characterize new devices, I think is not, to me, a modern era approach. And I do think that there's an opportunity now to develop what the buzzword we use now is pragmatic clinical trials, where we have an earlier opportunity to be able to access in real time, real world patients from very large, well-characterized registries and compare some of the key endpoints with what is a very large database of other devices that have been available and approved. So my hope is in the future we can simplify, reduce the cost of these important clinical trials and not have to do the same level of multiple, multi-thousand patient randomized trials. And the randomized trials can be embedded in these registries as well if you choose to randomize. So I'm hoping the future will be different in terms of how we do clinical research. With respect to technology, I will say that in drug-eluting stents, we have largely achieved, I think, pretty much a flattening point, a leveling off of the technology advances. This is a thin strut design with a very low dose of sirolimus that has these abluminal grooves that, with a bioresorbable polymer, there isn't that much room, I think, for important evolution of this device. This would be by virtue of characteristics, would be different than anything we have in the United States and would be viewed as a novel device, even though it's been around for, as the better part of a decade. So for DES, I think we've seen a flattening of the technology evolution, but there are other new drug-eluting stents that you just saw that are bioresorbable, and there are some hybrid designs that are being developed, and there are multi-drug combinations that are being developed by other sponsors and interesting versions of drug-eluting stents. But I think the Firehawk, to me, has the opportunity to be really a standard for years to come in this space.
I have another question down that road, and that is, 35,000 patients, it's safe, it's efficient, we know it all. What does it take for a stent to be adopted in a marketplace, for, let's say, the US, for a stent to being used, to be, taken off the shelf and put into patients?
It's a great question. There have been two other non-US drug-eluting stents that have gone through the gauntlet of randomized trials and FDA approval, neither of which has really been able to achieve traction in the US market in an important way. There's another study that's been completed that is pending FDA approval, a device from China, and Firehawk would be the next. I think it needs a very strong sponsor. I think that the economics, need to be appropriate and reasonable. I think in the United States, if you have a device that there's still physician preference still plays a very large role. So I think if we can get the data out to a large enough community of physicians, they have opportunity to use the device. I still think that there's a real chance that this could become, one of the key products that we would use in a routine way.
Thank you. Are there any questions? We don't have any further, so I think we move on. Thank you very much, Marty, for this interesting overview.